So I'm Jacqueline Sundberg. I'm the outreach librarian here, and it's a pleasure, as always, to organize these events for the public. And I see that today a lot of people have interest in today's topic, and we're very excited to welcome Christine McNair. Her name's on screen. You can see her in the front row here. And my colleague will be introducing her in a moment. But I just want to take care of a couple housekeeping things as we get started. This is a hybrid event, so in the room, know that you're joined from other rooms around the province and perhaps worldwide by about 50 other folks who are tuning in from wherever they are. I do want to take a moment to acknowledge where we are for those of us who are here in person. We're here on the lands of McGill's downtown campus. And this building and this place has long served as a place for meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous nations, including the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe nations. We honor, respect, and recognize those nations as the traditional stewards of the lands and waters on which we meet today. And today's event is really a continuation of an exchange of ideas that's ongoing between the Canadian Conservation Institute and a project that's housed here in the McGill Library. The project is called Hidden Hands, and it's looking at a lot of different things, but focusing partly on a collection of palm leaf manuscripts called Olas. And that's been one subject of exchange of ideas and information between us and the Canadian Conservation Institute. So you're going to hear from our special guest today, Christine McNair, and I'm going to pass it over. I'm going to invite Dr. Anna Winterbottom, who's part of that project here at the library. And she's going to introduce our speaker and a little bit more about the project.
Thanks so much, Jacqueline. So it's a great pleasure to introduce today Christine McNair from the Canadian Conservation Institute in Ottawa. The CCI is a world-renowned research and treatment centre in preservation and conservation. And Christine is joining us today as Conservator for Books, Treatment and Care Collection in the Objects, Paper and Archaeology Division. And as Jacqueline mentioned, we've begun an ongoing relationship with CCI, and we've just signed a memorandum of understanding. And so Christine's presence here today is thanks to this ongoing relationship. Christine has a BA in English Literature with a minor in Art History from Arcadia University and an MA in Conservation Studies from Westdean College in the UK. Her 2.5 years of graduate work in the conservation of books and library materials culminated in a thesis which investigated the history and the conservation of textile bookbindings. Before joining the Canadian Conservation Institute, Christine interned or worked in the Centre de Conservation du Livre in France, the London Metropolitan Archives in the UK, at Archives Ontario, and Library and Archives Canada. She is the president of the Canadian Bookbinders and Book Artists Guild, and she was formerly editor of the CBBAG Journal and former treasurer of the Book and Paper Group of the Institute of Conservation in the UK. Her research interests include modern materials in books, parchment, alum tanned skin, and wax seals. And she's also published in international and domestic journals on book conservation, treatments, and research. And before her work in conservation, she was also employed as an editor's devil, or interesting phrase, or book designer at a literary press. She used to do letterpress printing through the Pearl Press, although I understand that interest is on the back burner at the moment. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Christine, and I really look forward to hearing her talk.
Thank you very much, Anna, and thank you to everyone who's here today in person and online. I really appreciate you here for my little talk about the book as evidence. So this will be a talk where I'm going to a bit overwhelm with images and talking about all the possibilities, because to me, book conservation is an art in some sense of possibilities, that we are looking at the history of the book and focusing on how we can see the historical context of where a book comes from and how that can help us better understand that book and the culture it comes from. So the Canadian Conservation Institute, just for some context, was created in 1972 to promote the care and preservation of Canada's cultural heritage. It's a special agency of the Department of Canadian Heritage. And I am the book conservator at CCI. So my role is trifold. I treat artifacts of significance from Canadian public collections. I engage and collaborate in research, and I lead knowledge dissemination, so training and publications. So the CCI Paper Lab in particular has 3 conservators, myself, a book conservator, a works of art on paper conservator, and an archival photo conservator. But CCI itself has a number of other disciplines of types of conservation, conservators, we have conservation scientists. When we look at what is book conservation, the very broadest way of describing it is it's the conservation of bound objects. So that can encompass a lot of things, though. Often we think about the very formally sewn pre-19th century books, but it can encompass a perfect binding, medieval parchment. And particularly, I like to emphasize that it can encompass things outside of the Western tradition of bookbinding. So like palm manuscripts, Batak manuscripts, and working with Asian manuscripts as well from Japan that involve thread and side stitch. For my training, like we mentioned, I went to Western College. I did a 2.5-year MA program, work placements and a thesis. This is just my particular path to book conservation. There are other ones that don't involve going to the UK. But this was my particular one. And here are some images from my MA thesis. This was part of my MA thesis where I was treating a velvet binding belonging to the Chichester Cathedral Library. And these are some lovely photomicrographs of the silk textile of the silk velvet binding. So book conservators, just a part of this initial part is kind of looking at where book conservation came out of and what it is we do and study. Book conservators, these are topics that we tend to look at. We're focused on the materiality of the book. So we look at the materials themselves. There's conservation science. We look at the history of the book. Archaeology of the book is often used. That's also sometimes used as a term for codicology. In the sense of archaeology of the book, for book conservators, it's often looking at the layers of production within the context of the history of the book. Binding and conservation techniques, preventative conservation, housing, and ethics. We can't really talk about book conservation and its evolution unless we talk about the Florence flood. So in 1966, the River Arno overflowed, damaging untold numbers of cultural artifacts, including books. And part of what happened after that was a big surge of people coming to Florence to assist with the recovery and salvage, particularly young conservators, they would have called themselves particularly young restorers at the time, and craftsperson. And it was a chance for all of them to meet in person and exchange techniques. One of the outflows of that big process in this massive salvage and recovery thing is that we did come to understand moving away from just the term restoration into book conservation. And a lot of the things that we take for granted now as part of conservation, such as phase boxes, limp vellum bindings used as a conservation binding, those all initially had their seeds in Florence flood. So these are some definitions for these terms. These are not the only definitions for these terms. This is often how I distinguish them for myself when I'm working as to whether it's repair, restoration, conservation, or preservation. So repair can be functional repairs of varying degrees of quality. Restoration, I associate when I'm talking about it with an aesthetic focus. It's about returning to an original state. It's and the best restorers historically have amazing hand skills and are very talented in fine binding. Conservation tends to be a bit of a balance between the function and then a protection of what I'm calling in this talk the evidence, the historic materials and construction of artifacts. And we operate within a scientific and ethical framework as part of our professional skills. And then preservation is active steps that we take to preserve a book or a collection that are about the things around it. So storage, housing, environmental controls, good housekeeping, things like that, handling. So it's a spectrum. It doesn't, it includes the restoration and preservation. And it has a bit of, there are bits of things that some people might agree with these definitions and other people may not, but that's what. So when I talk about an ethical framework for how we work as conservators, these are things that we keep in our mind that are based on the Canadian Association of Conservation Ethics and other codes of ethics throughout Canada and beyond. These are some of the aspects that we look at. We looked at, can our treatment be reversible? We try not to do things that are irreversible, although inevitably when you change something, you change it forever. But we try to make sure that our treatment is reversible. We're transparent about what we're doing. We have good documentation. We maintain our hand skills. We consult with our colleagues. We recognize our limitations. I think that's really important in conservation, to recognize your limits and where you need to learn more. And minimum intervention. So in the sense of minimum intervention, I don't mean it in the sense that we just do a tiny bit of nothing and then nothing else. It means that we do the minimum required for that object. And this is a lovely scale from the Westeen College blog, which has kind of the list of how intervention can be, from minimal intervention to nothing, all the way up to rebinding. So this is specifically with books, like how you can alter the book and how interventive you're going when you follow these paths. So books are, as we know, very common objects. They're primary record sources. They're very much the end product of a series of craft industries, which isn't thought about too much. And they can be time capsules for products of those craft industries. A lot of things actually get preserved really well in books that don't get preserved well other places, partially because of the closed nature of the book. They are also feats of engineering in the sense that they are almost always required to move. Books are objects of use, unlike a lot of our cultural artifacts. So they are, generally speaking, intended to be read and to be handled. So that changes how we approach them, and it changes how we perceive them. So often I talk about sometimes books as machines because they are required to move. They are not static. And depending on how they are made and where they are made, those principles of their construction will define what they are capable of doing in terms of movement, how easily we can access them, and what we need to do to protect them. These are just some various types of binding styles, showing the different opening characteristics, from a perfect binding, which is a very stiff opening, a semi-limp vellum binding, which is also very stiff. And then the top two, the one on the left there, is a perfect binding where the material is flat against the spine, versus a book with a hollow. You can see the hollow there. So those need to be supported differently, even within their cradles, in order to prevent damage. So books, there are a near infinite variety of forms that share a common role of being designated as books. And there are many anatomies of the book. So often you'll see these diagrams specifically about like the one on the left there. But there are many anatomies that don't follow this particular perspective of how we approach books and come from different national and historical traditions. So there are many ways of identifying, and it's very important as a conservator that we try to inform ourselves about those types of being and those structures. So now there's just going to be a whole series of images to show you what I mean. And I would say the majority of these are Western binding examples, but it's to show just, even when we talk about something as simple as the board, which is the material underneath the covering material, there can be many different types of board: pasteboard, strawboard, rope board, wooden boards, mill boards, and they all say something different when a conservator looks at them and can give some context for that book as to where it was made, what country it was made, and what time period it was from. These are just some different types of paper coverings they can have. They're all would be covered under the sense of a paper binding, but each of them is saying something very different to me in terms of where it has come from and time period. Similarly, often we might talk about leather bindings, but there are leather bindings of varying types of animals. Alum tod skin, which is not actually a tan skin, but a different process, parchment. And then these are textiles. Textiles are a particular interest of mine because I did the MA thesis, but and those go from very day-to-day publishers' cloth bindings that we know to artists using burlap, sackcloth, silk embroidered, velvet. And then you can look at the sewing. How is the book constructed? What type of materials are being used to pull those sections together? That can tell us a lot about where the book is coming from. And here you can see me using a sewing frame when I'm doing a treatment. And next to it is the Smythe sewing machine. And I like to emphasize that until the 19th century, all books were hand sewn. So there is a lot of information in the sewing in terms of what the thread is, what the supports are, how that book was pulled together with the sewing. And then here again are some other, the wire stitch binding. You see those sometimes where it's actually, instead of thread, like instead of a machine thread, it's actually wire run through the book. And then these are different varieties of end bands. End bands are those bits that on a hardcover book you might see where it's decorative. Often they're, what we show there is made end bands. So now they're often made end bands, which are applied with adhesive, and they have just a little stitching design. But historically, they were stitched into the structure of the book. So they actually had a much stronger connection of the book to the covers, and it was more of an integral part of the overall binding, the end band. So depending on how the end band is constructed, and then as we increased, obviously, our printing capacity and therefore our need for binding, that became simplified, ending with the made there. But interesting little case study. So this was a book I treated called The Martyr's Mirror. It dated from the 1700s. It was a Mennonite religious text, and it had what you could describe as a made end band in the sense that that was not sewn into the sections. The end bands typically around that period would have been sewn into the sections and brought up around a center support. This one was actually just sewn into a material, so just sewn into the cloth and then adhered. But it was very much of that period for that particular cultural context, that particular cultural context of a German school of binding from this period. That was very in line with that, and it was done by hand. So it looked as if it had been a worked end bin that would gone in through the sections, but it was not. It was sitting just on the outside, and it still served a functional structural purpose. Often bookbinders are quite harsh with made end bands because they're not sewn, so they're not part of the structure. But it does still provide at the head and the tail of a book some support and structure. So books as evidence, just a note that books are very old. I think a lot of people know that, but it is nearly 2,000 years of bookbinding history, and it can give us a lot of information, even just through the variants. So before the 19th century, like I mentioned, all books were sewn, covered, and finished by individuals working within dominant techniques by national tradition, social sphere, religious environment, and the particular quirks of their individual workshops. So choices that we make can speak to the wealth and position of the owner. These two bindings are also from when I was doing my textile bookbinding thesis. So these are actually the same book, same printing, same year. It is a book of Psalms, I believe. And the one on the left with the ribbons, that is a silk velvet binding belonging to Chichester Cathedral Library. And the one on the right is belonging to the Victoria and Albert Museum, also a velvet binding, but with much more elaborate use of embroidered metal thread, fine precious materials and a gophered gilt edge as opposed to just a lightly gilt edge. So both of these things are indicating things to me when I see them bound this way, in part because textiles were extremely expensive in the past. Leather was the more common material. So textiles are actually considered an elevation of sorts when we're presenting binding. So these, even though they are very different and they come from different perspectives, different levels of binding, they say something about how the book was meant to be elevated through its materials. And looking at those designs, you'd be able to better understand other books with those same sorts of designs in collections in order to make some general. These are examples that come often in now and again in the news, where we find old material used that was recycled and used in a manuscript or a printed book. That was very commonly done for book covers, spine linings. And when I say evidence, that could include things that are not desirable. So poor quality materials, history of previous repairs, notations in marginalia, dirt and damage. I have known conservators that have analyzed the dirt within the gutters of books to find out more about the scriptorium or the location where the book was originally came from, the provenance. So something that we often talk about too is that marks and things that don't belong there, they can give us a lot of evidence of the use. There's a quite good quote by Hannah Juska, who talks about interpretation. So that interpretation has to be done with the authentic qualities of the object. So if we want to pass down objects and understand them as true objects, we need to care for the original substance, the material of it, not just the content. And the extent to which that original material is spared during a particular operation in conservation is going to depend very much interpretation, mostly by the conservator. So how the conservator looks at that book, how they decide what to keep, how they preserve the original materials. And the goal is to preserve as much as possible, so as true an interpretation and discussion can flow from the object. This is a manuscript in the collection of the British Library with an Egerton 886. What's interesting about it is that smear there. So the reason that smear is there is because this book was actually used as a birthing aid. So women would kiss it during labor at that point and ask the saints for help and protection for herself and her child during labor. So that's why that smear is there. So we would never want to remove that, because that tells us so much about how important this book was within that community and how it served its purpose. So, and this is another quote, there's no such thing as restoring an old binding with obliterating its entire history, which is a very dramatic way of noting that when you disbind and rebind something, it changes it forever. This is an extreme circumstance where a bookbinder is working with books that were stored in salt mines after World War II. And in that case, he disbound the books and then they were rebound without their original bindings. So this is that quote that I'm talking about. Here you can see a paper repair. This is not my paper repair, but it is an older paper repair I found in a book that I was working on. It's got this kind of translucent Western paper rather than what we would use now, which is So I do think it's important for conservators to think about how our conservation techniques and materials contribute to cultural memory, and that if we tie our culture, our history to objects, and conservation has an intimate connection to those objects that most people don't get to have. So we get to look at the makings and materials of objects, and depending on how we protect that object, it will determine on what follows forth. These are the Nag Hammadi codices that were discovered in 1945. They were found in their bindings originally, but those bindings were removed, which changes the meaning. Poor repairs, restorations. These are examples that probably you've seen in the news where there's been an attempt, often by a volunteer, someone very well-meaning. So I don't think, none of these were done with malice. Very well-meaning changed an artifact in order to, in their hope, due to their care, better preserve it, but then cause damage that was very difficult to remove. And the one library binding example there is just for a particularly large book, a large Neptune Atlas, which library binding is not the best structure for such a large book, which requires so much more width and breadth of movement. So I've put in that same kind of category, well-meaning. And that's another well-known example. There's often this framework around talking online. You know, is it true? Is it necessary? Is it kind? Is it helpful? I do find it interesting to apply that to conservation as well. Is the repair true? Is it necessary? Is it kind? And by kind, I mean too, is it sympathetic? Is it sympathetic to what the object is? And is it helpful? Does it help our understanding? Does it allow it to be understood and used? So this is just a run through of a very complex project. The Salesian Antiphonal, which belongs to St. Mary's University, originally from Belgium. It was made for the Abbey of Salesians in 1554, which was destroyed during the Napoleonic Wars. And this book was brought to Nova Scotia in the 19th century. Here we can see some evidence of the prioress who commissioned this book. It was commissioned for their anniversary. I think it was their 300th anniversary. And there are a lot of portraits of nuns in this book. It's very unusual to have an antiphonal, which is a large scale book filled with illuminations, never mind illuminations that also have individual portraits of nuns that are identified by name. And the names of the nuns in this book do match with the electoral records of the time. A lot of research was done on this by curator Judy Dietz, who did a quite good study. So when it came to CCI, it was here for examination and analysis before treatment. And that was my first job at CCI, just staring at a beautiful book and writing down what I can see on every single page. So it was actually really, really lovely. And I worked with a lot of wonderful colleagues on this project. But you can see, when you look at something truly, there are things that you can learn about the manuscript by slowing down and looking at it, like how the pricking, which delineates the ruling on the manuscript, how that was made. A colleague of mine looked at the prick marks to see which direction it was coming from and was able to ascertain what type of tool was used. You can see notations and editor's marks made during the construction of the manuscript. There are erasures. There in that blue A there, you can see the little a, which marks, because they were done by different people, right? So the notations were done by one person and another person was doing the initials. So the person doing the text and notations put an A here, basically, like here's my little A, put an A here. And it's a bit hard to see here, but in the antiphonal, what we noticed by looking at it over a period of time is there's actually a diagonal slash behind all the blue letters. So it was not just put an A here, it was put an A here, make it blue. And these are the varieties of types of initials that you can see in this manuscript that were described. There's some quite fun marginalia too. I didn't bring a picture of that, but I should have. It's quite adorable. We're lucky at CCI to have scientists who can do analytical work for us. So they did a lot of analysis. Through that process, the most interesting part of that process for this book was the identification of posnojakite, which is a copper sulfite hydroxide hydrate. So that's basically the green pigment, essentially. But that's not a common green pigment. If you're looking at green pigments in medieval manuscripts, that is not one that comes up very often in conversation, if at all. But it also ties this book to its city of origin, because there is a mine nearby that would potentially have supplied the persons making this. Here, just looking at some of the damage before treatment, some loss. And here we can see this was a big book. It had big, heavy wooden boards. And a lot of the damage that we saw in the manuscript was tied to a rebacking. So an attempt to rebind the book, they put a new leather spine, that's what rebacking meant, and attached the boards with nothing else other than the leather. So the leather quickly broke, fell off. The book was therefore not under pressure. Therefore, the parchments, it's all parchment leaves, were moving under variations in humidity, and the pigment was becoming detached in certain areas. So it was all a series of processes. This book is meant to work as a system where it is under pressure and the pigments are protected, and it was not done. Further X-rays of the boards, you could see there a repair at the bottom, metal spikes. Part of our ethical mandate is to have consultations. So we had consultations with other conservators, both within Canada and abroad, about how to approach this unusual book. Very kindly, the person that did do the reback, likely in the 19th century, did leave the original sewing. So we very much did not want to interfere with the original sewing, if at all possible. So that made for some tricky calculations about how to attach these wooden boards and return it to its proper system of compression. There was some very minor dry cleaning and tear repair. There was some consolidation of pigment to try and keep it from flaking off the surface. I consolidated the leather. There had been a very unfortunate leather dressing that had been applied to the whole book covers, which caused a lot of cracking. And then this is me preparing the boards with my colleague, Catherine Lee. And here you can see you're removing the marbled end papers that are not contemporary with this book. But we are leaving the 19th century leather repairs. It's a bit hard to see in here, but we did leave those. We didn't need to remove them, so we didn't. It was a bit aesthetically displeasing to see them on the cover, but were not causing any harm, and the likelihood of causing harm, that risk was higher than there was very little benefit to removing them. So we left it there as part of the history of the object. And then this is me repairing the boards with my furniture conservator friend, Amanda Salmon. And then this is after removing the remnants of that leather. You can see the original sewing. All the extensions, the supports, they would have gone over into the board. Those were cut flush when the rebacking was done, I believe. So we came up with levels of attachment to reattach this book. Here you can see I'm re-sewing, but I'm re-sewing extensions onto the original sewing by going 1+. So I'm going not within the center of where the original sewing was, but one a bit, and then attaching those extensions to allow for a fuller attachment to the boards. I sewed new end bands because the end bands had also been cut flush with the head and the tail, just to provide a bit more structure to the book at the head and the tail, because they were integral to its construction. And then this was the very complicated board reattachment. Essentially, the extended sewing supports went through there was a lining on the spine, and then it went through this alum Todd sub spine, and then the supports were laced into the boards. And then only once that was done, once the boards were very firmly attached with a sub binding, only then was there a bit of new leather, goat skin added over the spine in order to make it look more of a kind, make it look sympathetic. But it's very much not, we would never rely upon that as a structure. It does not have enough structural strength to support a book of this kind. And there you can kind of see on the left there the befores in terms of the compression versus the after when the book boards are sitting properly. And that immediately after time, when the parchment started to relax, parchment is very sympathetic and reacts very well, reacts to good conditions. And in this sense, when you could see that the parchment originally became less distorted once it was back in its original binding. If you want to find more information and more cohesive, perhaps information, more in depth, there are these videos on the CCI website. These are from a large-scale exhibition that was originally displayed at the Nova Scotia Art Gallery and then subsequently has gone on to be in Belgium. This is just a short thing about another book that was treated, French Huron Dictionary. It is a very important dictionary to the Yowenda Project, which is a revitalization of the Huron-Wendat language in the community of Wendake. But the parts that are related to evidence is during the treatment, I was able to access the spine and determine that the section at the bottom there where you can see the sewing holes are not aligned, that confirmed the fact that that particular section did not belong as part of the original manuscript. It was done in a very different hand. It was a very different application of the ink, and the sewing cords did not align. Originally, they thought it might have just been a detached section. So it was kept with the book, but it was not resewn into it. And then that's another example of spine waste where you can see some text from a parchment document that was used in that book. So these are things I consider when I'm looking at a book. What is the significance and to whom? Because significance can be local, it can be municipal, it can be with one community, it can be with large national significance. And each of those are valid and important when we're looking at something. How will it be used? That's very important with regards to books. Is it replaceable? And what will we preserve and what will we destroy if we intervene in this case? As watching this book, I do think that it's very important that we're clear on that what is the benefit? That the benefit will be that this book will continue to exist and will continue to provide us with information about its context. And the question is this a book? It is actually a book. These are actually 3 books. These are books actually that were uncovered by archaeologists. So these are books that belonged, they were part of the pre-Confederation library in Montreal. They were uncovered during the dig. And this is still book conservation, but it was treated mostly by the archaeological conservator at CCI, with some discussion with me and also with my colleague Tiffany Egmore, a book conservator as well. But they're a very interesting example where even in this state, even when they are this damaged and so difficult to access, you can still see individual pages with information, and that gives us information that aligns with the content of that library, and that gives us information about how that library collected its books. So it's a really interesting process. That is a very difficult that's a very difficult object to treat, obviously. A lot of it is rehousing, but there was actually the use of an interesting archaeological technique that we only use, and this is one of the few exceptions where we use an irreversible treatment, which is Caroline, which is a coating to allow for the access to the content. So that's kind of all I had to say. Thank you to my colleagues who contributed to some of these slides. Thank you for your patience. I have just been talking, but I appreciate everyone who's listening today and for McGill for inviting me.
Thanks so much, Christine, for that fascinating talk. We have about 15 minutes for questions, and I know there are some coming in on the Zoom.
Speak into the microphone.
Oh, sorry. So just thanks again, Christine, for the wonderful talk. We're going to take questions from the room. So I see one right at the back, followed by the lady in yellow.
So first of all, thank you very much. So you began your discussion, you mentioned Florence. So it reminded me that I think in 2002 or so, there was a tremendous, terrible flood in Prague. Hundreds of thousands of books I remember were damaged, and I remember there was a lot of press at the time about the books were being put into deep freeze, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Could you comment about that? And also, if you've ever been involved in a project like that, where materials have gone into some kind of freeze.
So I'll just repeat the question so that those on the Zoom can hear it. So we heard earlier from Christine about the flood in Florence, and the question was about the flood in Prague back in 2002. And about the books after that were put into deep freeze. And so could you comment on that, Christine?
Sure. So yeah, that is definitely something that is done in mass. I almost said mass casualty, but that is kind of what that is, where it's a massive amount of books, and it's beyond your capacity or anyone's capacity to treat and dry them out in an efficient way. Putting them in, freezing them is a stopgap. It's essentially a stop before removing the moisture. And they did do that in Prague. They did all kinds of different things. I think they also were experimenting with oxygen-free environments. And so, yeah, that is very much a common technique when there's a disaster and there's too much to handle, that they will go in the freeze. I'd not necessarily usually by the collection of the library, but often by a restoration company that comes and assists and things like that. So I have been involved only very on a sideways way. CCI doesn't have a collection. Well, it does have a collection. It has the CCI library, which is a collection of conservation texts. But in terms of a collection that would potentially have flooding, I haven't worked at one in a long time. So.
Oh, we had another question here.
Sure.
Okay. Any other questions from the room? I see Anna at the back there.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. I'm just wondering, like maybe on the last, what's the research component look like? Like how much of your work, how much of your time, how much of your thought is about sort of developing the techniques or experimenting and developing new initiatives and techniques, basically. What's the research program like?
So the question is about the role of a conservator and how much time is spent on research and how much on conservation.
Development of and sort of like what's the program of development for sort of like different conservation techniques, experiments, all that stuff.
And for more detail on the development of techniques.
So at CCI, I mean, in an ideal world, we do 1/3 of each of our things. So we'd have 1/3 of our time spent in treatment, 1/3 of our time spent on publications and training, and 1/3 of our time on research. It really depends on the year. So some years I have more opportunity to focus on research than others. I'd say I aim for about 1/3 of my time to be spent on research and development of new techniques or research into materials. So my current research project relates to modern materials in books. I'm really interested in how those will change over time, partially because they haven't been looked at too closely yet, specifically within a library and archival context. So that is part of a working group that's at CCI, where a bunch of conservators and conservation scientists have come together to look at modern materials and how we might approach them in terms of research and discovery.
I'll voice a couple of questions from the chat because we have lots of very interesting people at home. Maybe I'll ask 2 questions that maybe you could answer concurrently. The first one was just how long do you think it would have taken to make a manuscript like the antiphonal that you first worked on? And then also, with so many clients, how does CCI decide which books to work on and when?
Okay, I will try to answer. In terms of the antiphonal, I'm not sure I could say accurately how much time that would take, other than it would take quite a long time, because it was quite a large book, both in terms of the height, but also in terms of the depth. So it would have taken quite some time. It would have been part of, when it was created, it was likely created along with other manuscripts by in a scriptorium, but I can't say exactly how long that would take, other than it would have taken quite a bit of time. So the second question was, how do we decide which books to treat and when? So at CCI, it is a bit of a different experience because we're small. And we treat things from public collections. So what happens is there's an application process where public museums, libraries, archives, cultural centers apply to send their artifact to us, and they tell us about their artifact. So they tell us about, in the case of books, they tell us about their book, how that book matters to them, their community, the collection, talk about the provenance of the book, talk about how the level of damage. CCI, generally speaking, has a policy of taking things that are more complex in terms of, so we don't want to take work away from private sector. So it's often we're taking things that are more complex, that have significance to their community, that might be interesting for research purposes as well if we're working on a particular research topic. And then just capacity. So because I'm the only book conservator at CCI right now, there's just going to be a limit to what I'm capable of doing within a reasonable time frame.
We had another question, or 2 questions from the group.
So thank you very much for your stupendous comments today. It's always been on the back of my mind. We receive donations here at the Rare Books Library. And if there is bacteria due to humidity, sometimes they donate books. How do you treat the bacteria? Do you use a chemical? And I'm very happy to hear about your new materials laboratory, because I'm not partial to leather binding. I find that it deteriorates and has a funny smell over time. But how do you treat that bacteria inside the mold on the paper? Do you put it a chemical? How do you destroy the growth of that bacteria? Is there a chemical you use?
So the question was about treating leather bindings.
No,
and
treating when you open the book, sometimes humidity causes bacteria or mold on the paper. So how do you stop that bacteria from growing? Do you use a chemical, some kind of chemical to blot it out, to stop, because it has, after it, we call it in French, moisissure. So after many years, it has a funny smell. Do you use a chemical to stop, to kill that bacteria? What do you do?
Okay, so the question is about bacteria or mold growing in paper manuscripts or books, and what can be done to stop the growth of that mold? Is it a chemical treatment, or would you use another method?
So mold is a kind of a tricky subject. It's we don't typically treat it with a chemical. With mold, a lot of what we do when we're doing treatment when we have a moldy object is trying to remove as much of the mold and mold spores as possible. So that's a physical removal process using a vacuum with a HEPA filter, using proper safety PPE, so protective equipment. There is a very well-written technical bulletin that CCI has put out that's available for free online on mold. And that has a lot of the guidelines of how we would approach, or how anyone could approach a moldy object if they have it. But we wouldn't apply a chemical. We would try to physically remove as much as possible. Very rarely, if there has been a massive mold problem on a book, I have washed a book. But that's very rare that I've done that. So typically speaking, it's just removing as much as possible and making sure we're following health and safety protocols, because mold can be very damaging and a health risk.
Just a couple more questions from the chat. I'll try 2 related questions, let's say. What kind of adhesives do you use when you're repairing books? And when are gloves required to handle books?
Okay, in terms of adhesives, we use a variety of things. The most common thing that we use is wheat starch paste, which is a paste that we make ourselves. Very occasionally we'll use methyl cellulose, and very occasionally we might use wheat starch paste mixed with PVA. That's more for box making though than actual treatment. And the question about gloves. So gloves, there's lots of information online about this now, but you do need to wear gloves when you have things with a lot of metal or photos. Those are the times when you absolutely need to wear gloves to not cause damage. When you're working with a book in general, including rare books, clean, dry hands are the best general policy, partially due to the sensitivity of the fingers. If gloves are required, it is better to do nitrile rather than cotton gloves. Cotton gloves are too thick. They don't give you the sensitivity of the fingers, and you can cause damage just by handling. So generally speaking, clean, dry hands. If you're going to wear gloves, then something like nitrile that's very thin that still allows you to have sensitivity.
I think we have time for one more question.
Right, so I think there was one.
It's a question, well, I'm teaching a book history class in our School of Information Studies, and I see the recording going on. I would love to, I see some of my students here. I advise to talk to my students, but I'd like to share with them. Would it be?
It will be put on the library's YouTube page.
Thank you so much.
Very shareable.
And thank you so much for the talk.
And maybe since that was a quick one, we can take
Yeah,
one.
so one more question.
You mentioned earlier that you tend to take on more complex projects and that you're the only conservator. Can you comment a bit on sort of the range of projects in the sense of how long they take? Like what would be a small project versus what would be a long project? And also, are you able to work on projects simultaneously?
So the question is about the range of projects from complex to more simple and whether you're able to take on projects simultaneously.
Yeah, so we definitely take on projects simultaneously. So I typically speaking have 4 to 5 to 6 books in the lab at a time. And depending where those are in their treatment, I'll work on one for a while, set it aside, have it do resting time or drying time and work on another book. So in terms of what is a long project versus a shorter project, generally speaking, CCI tries to get things done in under 2 years and often much less than that, often within a year. We don't want to keep things forever and ever and ever. We just want to make sure that we get them treated as best we can and as thoroughly as we can. So it really ranges. Like the antiphonal was a very long-term project because it was very intensive because there was a lot of examination and analysis before we even got to the treatment part. And then we were trying to figure out the treatment, which was very difficult because of the nature of how heavy the book was and the materials. Whereas other books, they're a little bit more straightforward. I can see where it aligns with other treatments I've done before, and I can follow a more regular path. So it really does depend quite a lot. It's not very straightforward, but I'm just the book conservator. We also have a works of art and paper conservator and a photo archival. We have furniture conservators, textile conservators, objects conservators, archaeological conservators, and fine arts at CCI.
Okay, well, I'll just pop over for a second. On behalf of Jacqueline, who had to jump out for a moment, I'd just like to thank everybody for joining us today, whether it's at home on Zoom or with us today in the room. We are recording this talk and it will be available in a couple of days on our YouTube page, on the McGill Library YouTube channel. And we will also send out a link to the talk to everybody who registered for the event. So please join me again in thanking our speaker today. And thank you for coming.
All our artifacts, books.